Hello everybody, today I will read an article that I wrote about a form of discrimination that I call intellectual classism. Let's have a look. What is discrimination? Let's try to define it as broad and generic as possible. Discrimination is the set of practices designed to humiliate, marginalize, disadvantage, delegitimize an individual or a group of people on the basis of negative and degrading judgment concerning his true or alleged way of being or his true or alleged belonging in a category. Needless to say, all forms of discrimination undermine human dignity, justice, and peaceful coexistence among people. Article 2 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights states it very clearly. Everyone is entitled to all the rights and freedoms set forth in the present declaration without distinction of any kind, such as race, color, sex, language, religion, political or other opinion, national or social origin, birth, or other status. Also, thanks to this fundamental text of international law, the awareness of the nature of discrimination has spread and is spreading. In Italy today, few would really have difficulty in giving a general definition of discrimination based on race, it would be more scientific to say ethnic, on religion or on sexual orientation. And this is not trivial at all. The first step, in fact, to defeating a form of discrimination is to identify it and define it clearly. Many of the forms of discrimination that we recognize today were not such yesterday, and they were not such because the collective sensitivity did not consider them as such, and did not consider them as such because those forms of discrimination had not been identified and there was no conscious that they existed. They had not been clearly defined as such. Think, for example, about the form of discrimination against women and their role. In the 90s, when I was 6 or 7 years old, and I was in elementary school, few would question whether the housework was to be done by women. Today, after more than 20 years, whether you accept it or not, it is, apart from the fanatics, of course, of the traditional family, and the sworn enemies of the imaginary gender theory, it is difficult to find who, man or woman, is not willing to renegotiate in a more equal sense the role of women in a relationship, in the family, or at home. There is still a long way to go, but there is no doubt that the right one has been taken. A similar thing can be said about the discrimination of homosexuality. In Italy, up to 30 years ago, homosexuality was little less than a taboo. Today, thanks to the courageous and meritorious work of gay activism, there is much more tolerance about sexual orientations other than heterosexual. That said, in my speech I will try to define a form of discrimination that today is not recognized as such, but that is widespread and has even terribly negative repercussions on democratic processes. I am referring to what I call intellectual classism. How can we define intellectual classism? First, we define the discriminatory form of class discrimination or classism. I take the definition of Wikipedia. Classism is prejudice or discrimination based on social class, on belonging, on social class. Discrimination against those who belong to a so-called inferior class is as old as the world. The history of the patricians and plebeians, the secession of the Aventine, and the story of Menenius Agrippa of the limbs and stomach give us a little confirmation. I'm talking about ancient Rome. The idea that individuals belonging to different social classes are substantially different from each other is as old as the other forms of discrimination, such as racial and sexist. Do we have today a problem of classism in Italy? Of course we have it. Of course, it would be enough to mention the Italian school. That Italian is classist was an accusation in the famous letter to a teacher by Don Milani, an Italian priest and pedagogue of the 60s, a thesis that after 40 years is still valid. And if it seems an exaggeration, tell me, is it perhaps undeniable that the selection made by the school is substantially on a class basis? Isn't true that in high schools there is prevalence of children of lawyers, doctors and various white-collar workers, whilst in the professional schools a prevalence of children of workers and immigrants? Difficult to deny it, huh? And what about the private lesson market? Are they not an organic element of education in Italy that benefits only those who can afford to pay 15, 20, 25 euros per hour for a lesson of Latin or mathematics? But even beyond the school, classism is present in Italy, very present. It's hard to flush it out, but it is there. It is not classist, for example, the paternalistically racist phrase like immigrants do jobs that Italians do not want to do anymore. Is it perhaps not true that, especially in southern Italy, it is important to study, it is important to take a piece of paper, because in this way you can avoid working with your hands and rather perform an intellectual and fulfilling job, maybe in a beautiful office? The derogatory phrase, go and dig the fields, is not a symptom of profound classism? Or, for example, the phrase, they would be better off working in a farm. There are truly many likewise expressions in Italian. So classism is present. Maybe it does not catch the eye, but it's just a matter of sensitivity to the topic. In Italy, there is classism, of course, but for a few, this is a problem. And intellectual classism, it is a particular form of classism that intersects with the classism just described, but at the same time constitutes a category in itself. Let's give a definition. Intellectual classism is discrimination based on belonging or not to a true or alleged presumed intellectual class. Why do I say true or presumed? Because the qualification can be considered a detectable criterion as a degree, for example, and therefore true, while criteria like reading many books, writing correctly, knowing how to speak well, getting informed, getting information from certain sources, having traveled or working abroad, learning foreign languages, and etc., on the other hand, they are very vague, and therefore presumed criteria, which create more inaccurate categories, but no less useful for practicing intellectual discrimination. But whether the intellectual class is true or presumed, the discrimination on which it is based is fierce and merciless. The place where it is probably easier to find this phenomenon is Facebook. The type insults I now propose will sound familiar to you, either because you read them, or because you received them, or because you wrote them. Illiterate, functionally illiterate, ignorant, goat, sheep. You don't even have the middle school grade. Study, take a degree and then we'll talk about it. Learn to write and then we will talk about it. My child writes better than you and like. All these insults can be found in comments and discussions on social networks and not only, and are intended to delegitimize the interlocutor on the basis of his supposed intellectual inferiority. Such insults, therefore, go far beyond rudeness. In my opinion, they are manifestations of intellectual classism, or if you prefer, of intellectual elitism. They are manifestations of a form of discrimination, and as such, they must be censored and fought. Possible objection. What does this mean? Is the opinion of anyone on any subject equal to that of an expert? Of course not. The opinion of an expert on a specific topic would always be worth more than that of a non-expert. But this does not mean that the experts are authorized to humiliate the non-experts from the top of their titles, nor that an expert automatically has greater authority than other people on subjects other than his specific ones. Another possible objection, but it's not true that what Umberto Eco said. Umberto Eco is an Italian intellectual who's dead now. Namely, that the social media have given the right to speak to legions of idiots. If you're referring to the flat earthers, that is to those who believe that the earth is flat, or to the creationists, that is those who believe that the earth has little more than 6,000 years and not 4.5 billion years, or to the no-vax, that is those convinced of the uselessness or the danger of the vaccine, you are absolutely right. But I agree that there are people around that spread the network of absurd stories that unfortunately some believe. It is comforting, however, that they are few. And yet, even this case, 1. Offending in a discriminatory manner is reprehensible, and 2. Offending in general does not serve anything. If one wants, he can try to provide arguments to disprove the bizarre thesis, but possibly without any pompous or disrespectful tone. But the point is that intellectual discrimination is most often directed towards those who express ideas or opinions that are legitimate but different from their own, from one's own. Most often it is about political ideas or opinions, and here is how intellectual classism is linked to the democratic phenomenon and constitutes a threat. Let's be sincere now. Class intellectual discrimination is mostly carried out by leaders, members and sympathizers of the left parties. This is the case at least in Europe and in North America. Those who express vision or political position different from progressive have often received insults on their alleged intellectual inferiority. Why did the left of the Western world fall into the scene of intellectual arrogance? I make an hypothesis. The origin is perhaps to be traced in the 60s, years in which the most influential intellectuals of the Western world, such as Michel Foucault and Noam Chomsky, for example, showed solidarity with the youth movement that called for peace, freedom and justice, a progressive movement that was soon occupied and, in many ways, deformed by left and far left parties and movements. Since then, the image of an opposition between a progressive and intellectual left on the one hand, and a conservative, retrograde and rough right on the other survives until today, isn't it? The intellectual classism has therefore introduced in the left the artificial dichotomy, we the educated ones versus the others, the uncultivated, a discriminatory distinction that so badly has done to the capacity of analysis of the reality of the left of all the Western world. As for Italy, it is really easy to trace the striking cases of intellectual classism. Whenever Silvio Berlusconi has won, the left has blamed the fact to the stupidity, roughness, facileness of the Italians, rather than questioning their mistakes and faults. In a specular way, the victories of the left have been hailed as the triumph of civilization over barbarism. Therefore, the unexpressed thought has been grafted on, that when the left loses, it is because people do not understand, people do not get there. Sometimes this explanation even comes to be explicit, as in the case of the Italian constitutional referendum of December the 4th, 2016. Now, Since undergoing discrimination creates frustration first and anger and desire for revenge afterwards, we can explain why many, often middle-low classes, see in the left a contemptuous and arrogant intellectual elite, a club of snobby with the nose and the little finger up, ready to laugh at the opinions of the plebs, and eventually to correct and educate them, with the practical consequence that you may imagine. Isn't that the election of Trump cannot be explained even in a small way like that, as the desire to punish the political intellectual elitism represented masterfully by the Democratic Hillary Clinton? But since the main purpose of this article is to demonstrate that intellectual classism is a form of discrimination, that is, an idea of superiority without any logical or scientific foundation, I will now try to give you a little logical demonstration. Let's have a look. Let's suppose, in the intellectual classist way, that there is a class of people who, due to inferior cognitive abilities or lower levels of education, are not able to vote correctly. This would result in the need to review universal suffrage and universal vote, and to propose a test that excludes those who are unable to express a conscious voting preference. Well, at this point there would arise a problem. Where do we put the bar? How intelligent or informed should the future holders of the rights to vote be? So this is already a problem, but let's move on. Whatever the criterion, once the census of the persons worthy of voting is done, there will be always a part that will claim to be intellectually superior to the rest, which will require the exclusive right to vote. A similar vicious circle could lead to the legitimate conclusion, according to this perverse logic, that it is better to let vote only the most intelligent, informed, and aware person of the country, the absolutism of the vote. And who is able to guarantee that the most intelligent and informed and the most aware person cannot express the same voting preference as the most stupid, ignorant, and unaware voter? Who? But no, it is not like that. Historically, this is not the case, because the worst regimes were born from the initiative of people or groups who thought they knew better what was to do than the rest of the population. They were born of blows and coups. They were born from the contempt or fear of popular will. Some examples: the Soviet Union, coup by the Bolsheviks; fascism, son of the support of the economic elites frightened by the people that was turning to left parties; Nazism, Hitler's coup at the time that he was beginning to lose electoral consensus; Francoism, military coup. But it is not so also for the trivial consideration that all men are endowed with reason, whatever their level of education. This is reiterated in Article 1 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience, and must act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. And since everyone is endowed with reason and conscience, all are able to make choices based on their ideas, opinions, and fundamental, based on their own experience, their perception of reality. The democratic principle states that the best way to collectively take a choice is to seek advice from everyone, because everyone is a bearer of a good reason. A good partial reason, of course, but still a good reason, with the assumption that everyone is moved by good faith. The sum of good partial reason gives contradictory results that are read with the majority criterion. Here is the substance of democracy. Then comes everything else: the institutional forms, the democratic processes, the electoral laws, the party systems, etc. We come now to a conclusion. There are fireworks outside. First point. Intellectual classism is a form of discrimination that is widespread and must be tackled, which is not the same as saying that all opinions are the same, especially in specialist areas. Second point. Intellectual classism is an evil of so much of the Western left, which has made it lose not only consensus, but even the ability to conceive being sometimes wrong and recognize its faults. Third point. Intellectual classism is at the root of the dangerous belief that not everyone is able to give a conscious vote, which puts the goodness of the democratic principle in doubt. In short, the sooner it will be recognized that intellectual classism is a form of discrimination, which not only damages the dignity of the person, but also threatens the sanctity of democracy, the better it will be for all of us. Postscriptum. I advise everyone to read an open letter from physicist Stephen Hawking about the victory of Brexit and Trump. It is called "This is the most dangerous time of our planet" and was published by The Guardian. This letter ends with the word humility. Okay, thank you very much. See you next time. Ciao.